Welcome, everyone. This is the first attempt at our big questions and big exploring stuff. And I've got for today, Bec Linsday. Hello, Bec.
Hello.
Bec is a United Church minister who's actually on leave at this point in time, doing a doctorate on Ruth. So Bec is going to do one of our questions that has come in from someone. And someone has asked this question. When reading the Bible stories, how do we decide what is history, what is folklore, and what is morality tale? It's a really interesting one to explore, and Bec is one of our experts on this kind of conversation. So thank you for joining us. Bec, so when reading the Bible, how do we know what's what?
Well, I guess the way I would start thinking about it is asking how we engage with the different kinds of texts, the different kind of stories that we engage with every day in our life. So when I hear someone start something once upon a time, I respond to that really differently than if I see someone on my TV screen sitting at a news desk starting to talk to me, to give me the news. And that's because I have got all of this information in my head about what different genres are. So what different kinds of stories or different kind of texts or different kind of communications that people make with me. And so I know that I'm going to think differently about a fairy tale story than I am about the news, that I'm going to make different responses about what might be true or what I might expect to happen within that context. And the same is true within the whole range of different kind of stories and different kind of texts we have in the Bible. So not everything in the Bible works exactly in the same way. And so the best way that we can get to know those different kind of genres or different kind of story types is really by reading more and more and more. So the more that we read the biblical text, the more familiar we will be with the different kinds of stories and text types that we find within it. So that's a little read your Bible a bit more. And then you'll find—
Get out there and read.
Just got to get that one out at the beginning. But I think as we read more, we become more familiar with the different kinds of things that we find. And then the second thing that we can do is look for the clues that those different texts have within them, just in the same way that a fairy tale, an English language fairy tale, will start usually once upon a time. And then you're like, oh, yep, okay, I'm reading a fairy tale. Or a newspaper is set out in a particular way, so I know that I'm reading a newspaper and I know what to expect. Sometimes there are those same kinds of little clues within the Bible stories as well, that might help us to identify what it is that we're reading. So here are some examples that might help us to get our head around this. So in the book of Ezra, for example, the book of Ezra begins by saying, well, here is an edict, here is a letter that was written by Cyrus of Persia. And then it kind of puts out the letter, the edict that Cyrus has written. So we go, oh, okay, this one's telling us that it wants us to think about that point of time in history and to engage in the text as this is actually what happened. Or another example would be in the books of Kings, 1 and 2 Kings. They say, well, and you can look for more information about this in these other sources, in these other histories, these other chronicles that have been written. So it's our ears prick up and we think, oh, all right, this is trying to tell us something that we might think of using the word history. We'll come back to history a bit later. In the story where Jacob wrestles the angel in Genesis 32, there's a little bit at the end of that which we call an etiology, and that's where it tells us now because the angel or the being that Jacob wrestled hit his hip and he had a limp. Well, that's why we don't eat this particular part of the body anymore. And so kind of gives you a little moral of the story that doesn't quite fit, but obviously this story is being used to tell a particular, give a particular reason why something has become part of a culture. So again, our ears can prick up and we go, oh, there's a purpose. It's the text itself is telling us how to engage with it. Now you hold those examples and put them next to the book of Jonah, for example, which is one of the stories that I really enjoy engaging with. And when you read the book of Jonah, you see that actually there's not very much within it that looks historically true. There's not much that looks like what Nineveh was like, for example. So Nineveh didn't have a king. The sizing is all a bit funny. Everything in the story is exaggerated. Everything is described as being big. We have big fish, big storm, big city. Everything is big. And so the text is giving us some clues that maybe we're not supposed to be taking this as a historical story, but that there's something else that's behind it. And when we read the text and we look for those clues and those ideas about what the genre is, then we can, I guess, read it with more nuance and more appropriately, rather than going out, as some people have done in different points in time over history, trying to look for exactly which kind of fish might have been the one that was able to swallow Jonah. We can actually just read the story as, I guess, more of maybe that morality tale, or is trying to tell us something about who God is and who the people are in response to that. So that's one of the really important things, is to think when we're reading anything in the Bible, just like we do automatically when we're reading anything in our everyday, the rest of our everyday lives. What's the genre? What kind of story would it be? And how does the text itself tell us what that is?
I suppose people actually, some people would say, but that needs to be an event in history for it to be truth and real. Like some people would go, it has to have been there, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I did say we should come back to history, because history is a very interesting it's a very interesting idea. So when I was at school and I did history, the way I learned to think about history was that this is something that's actually happened. This is the fact. You can't argue with it because this is just what's happened. But I think, I'm not sure that history would be even taught that way anymore in the same way. Yes, there are facts and there are things that have happened, but when somebody tells the story of those facts or the story of those events, they're always putting their spin on it. They're always telling it through their own experience or the experience of the culture that they live in. And so when we're reading the biblical texts that are telling us something about history, we have to be careful that we're not putting our understanding, that I'm not putting my understanding of what history is on top of the text. Because the history that is told in the biblical stories is a theological history. It's a history that's asking the question of, where is God? Is God with us? And what does it mean to be God's people in relationship with God? And there's some really important events that seem to have a big impact on the way those stories have been collated together and put together in the Bible that we read today. And the most important one of those is the time of the Babylonian exile. So when the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, and when the temple where God is living is destroyed, and people are carried away from Jerusalem into exile in Babylon. And in that time, you can imagine you're this people who have a relationship, a particular relationship with this God, and you are, the covenant, that idea of God will be their God and we will be God's people. Yeah. And then suddenly the place where I identify God as dwelling is destroyed. So the questions that arise from that is, how does God let this happen? Did God let this happen, or is God not actually all that powerful after all? Who are we? Is God still with us? Is there any way that we might get out of this situation? And a lot of that question can be seen within kind of underlying a lot of the stories that we see in the Bible. And a really good example of how this works in history is again in those books of 1 and 2 Kings. So in 1 and 2 Kings, you've got descriptions of what's happening in the northern kingdom and descriptions of what's happening in the southern kingdom. And the most important thing in those stories is not how long someone was a king for, what they did in terms of their social justice program, how the community was, whether there were famines or anything like that in their time, or that everyone had something to eat. It's actually, they're all being judged by whether they did what was right in the eyes of God. And believe it or not, there are no kings in the northern kingdom who are said to have done what was right in the eyes of God. And only 2 in the southern kingdom who were said to have done what was right in the eyes of God. And this is then understood, and kind of that the way the writer is doing is kind of theologizing this, is that because of this poor leadership, that's what allows the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile to take place. That's the way they're kind of thinking through this situation. So if the kings had been better, if the kings had actually done what was right in the eyes of God, then maybe the situation would have been different. So if the people change and live by the covenant and live doing what is right in the eyes of God, maybe the future can look different than the reality that they're living through at that time. And it's really interesting to then look at the historical records that are available from the ancient Near East, and which kings, which Hebrew kings or leaders they've got information about, and see that some of the ones that seem to have been really important, there's not actually very much in the book of Kings, even though there's actually extra biblical information about them. And it's because the purpose is different. The reason that history is being written is to make a theological claim, to work out a theological idea, which is not what I think is happening if I read a history book.
So in a sense, when we come to the question of sort of fact, morality, tale, those kinds of things, in a sense, some of it, even the stuff that holds the fact, is telling the story of God's people, not just the history of history kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would say that the Bible is a relational book. There's never been this idea in Christian thinking, Christian understanding, or Jewish thinking and understanding, that like God has written down exactly the same words. You know, we've always translated the stories from different languages to other different languages. There's always been this sense of engagement and questioning and wrestling with the text. I mean, we go back to that story of Jacob, and the name that Jacob is given, Israel, the name that becomes the name of the people, is wrestling with God. So the Bible and the whole idea of being God's people is a relational one. And so the Bible has conversations within itself about what is true, and about what the best way to follow the covenant is. And there's not always, not every text in the Bible agrees with each other about what the answers to that are.
Well, that Jonah story is a great one. I can remember someone telling me once that Jonah is like a debate with Ezra and Nehemiah. So the inclusion of Gentiles and the exclusion, so Jonah goes and Nineveh is converted and becomes, that they follow God. They've become God-fearing believers, and Ezra and Nehemiah are going, divorce your foreign wives and let's go back to purity. And there's almost this debate that sits between one book of the scriptures and the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm currently studying Ruth, and I throw Ruth into that mix as well. Ruth is the foreigner who comes and finds a place within Israel, and then becomes the ancestor of King David. And again, now there's this conversation between the different stories that are there. I mean, I think you don't even have to go different books. But in the book of Genesis, we have two stories of creation that sit alongside of each other. And they tell different stories. They don't tell stories that are contradicting each other, in the sense that I would say the purpose of those stories is to tell us that God has created the world, set it in motion, and continues to be engaged and involved in the world. But the way that they go about telling those stories is very vastly different. And the picture of God that you get within those stories is quite different. Characteristics kind of come out. It's not to say that one of those stories is wrong or untrue, but that they might have a different purpose. They might be trying to evoke a different emotion or a different thinking, or they might be speaking against or to a different cultural construct. And then that's how those differences come out. And I think that's a really amazing and beautiful thing. If the Bible can argue and converse and dialogue within itself, if the biblical texts don't always have the answers of exactly what is the right thing to do right now, then that invites me into that conversation. And it's okay if I don't have it all figured out, because part of what I can do is wrestle, join in that wrestling with the Bible, wrestling with God about who God is and who God calls me to be. And that's part of where the life-givingness of the scriptures come in. That's why they've been enlivening for communities across so many years, is because there is that invitation to be participating within the life of the text.
And so in a sense, whether it's a morality tale or a history, you know, what folklore, morality tale or history is what the question is asking. In a sense, they all hold God's truth. And so whether it's a history section of our scriptures or whether it is a morality tale part of our scriptures, it still holds God's truth within it. It still speaks to us about God's story in this world. Would that be?
And more than that, it doesn't just speak to us, but it invites us to be part of the conversation. It invites us to be part of the ongoing working out of what it is to be in relationship with God, and for God to be in relationship with us, and for us to be, I guess, in that relationship with God in the context of communities that we live in.
So in a sense, it really always comes back to immerse yourself in the scriptures so you actually get to understand them, rather than just go, I'm not too sure if that's true or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the tricky things for those of us who've grown up in the church reading as Christian readers is that we've often been taught to read to look for one truth, to look for one idea, and then there's only one right idea within the biblical text. But the Bible doesn't, particularly if you look at the Hebrew scriptures, they don't let you have that certainty, because the more you read in them, the more that you can see these dialogues that the stories are having with each other. The idea that they're working it out as they go along. And I think that that's actually true in the New Testament too. Particularly if you look at the letters of Paul in the early church, they don't have it all together. They're trying to work it out as they go along of what it is to be God's people in their context. Now, there's one sense that that's a little bit scary, because suddenly the Bible is not the rule book telling me exactly what I need to do, but it's also really liberating, because it's saying there is room for the Bible to be engaged in what's actually going on in my life right now, not just in something that was going on thousands of years ago.
We've just finished a series on 1, 2, and 3 John. So those letters at the end there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed about those is that we're seeing one side of an argument of a church that's in a lot of trouble. Like it's struggling and breaking down. And so John is really getting one side of an argument there. And it's incredibly helpful for us if we want to see how to deal with a difficult situation, because that's exactly what he's doing. And so if we just look for the one truth of what he says rather than what he's doing, we miss so much of what that passages are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, we really appreciate that you're giving up some time to talk about your thoughts on that topic. I'm going to hopefully play with this in one of my sermons as well, because it's a big topic to walk around.
It is. And it's really important, because the way we understand what the Bible is and what it's trying to do is hugely important for us in terms of how we understand God and our relationship with God.
Yeah. Bec, thank you so much for giving up some of your doctoral study time and parenting life to speak with us.